welcome to the second in this series of employment relations podcasts on bargaining. We've previously dealt with two aspects of employment relations bargaining described by Walton and McKersey back in the 1960s, integrative bargaining and attitudinal structuring. Today, what we're going to deal with are two more traditional, perhaps more recognisable features of bargaining in employment relations. Those features being what Walton and McKersey described as distributive bargaining and intra-organisational bargaining. So distributive bargaining, what we're talking about here is the kind of things that we're familiar with seeing, the traditional wage bargaining, win-lose bargaining, where one person goes in and to get what they want, the other person has to give up something. Real trade-offs been going on within the employment relationship between employer and employees. Now, what we're going to deal with are a number of features of distributive bargaining to allow us to understand the process and to make sense of how distributive bargaining processes actually work. So a couple of features that we're going to look at, particularly in terms of utilities in distributive bargaining. We might translate that fairly unfriendly term of utility. Think about how much we want something, how useful it is to us. Now, of course, in the context of distributive bargaining, this sense of utility, the sense of usefulness, the sense of how much we really want this thing is a very powerful element within the bargain, and it will influence to a large extent the kinds of behaviours that we engage in. How hard we're likely to fight for something will depend to a large degree on how useful we find it, how much we want it. The second feature that we're going to be interested in distributive bargaining situations, and not just how much we want something, but also how likely it is that we'll get it. So we're going to think about issues of probability as well, because of course there's no point fighting for something, no matter how hard we want it, however much we want it, if it's extremely unlikely that we're going to be able to get it, regardless of what we do. So utility and probability are very important aspects of understanding behaviour in distributive bargaining, and in terms of planning our distributive bargaining activities themselves. This aspect of planning is another important part of what we'll talk about today, because planning to do bargaining in a distributive sense is a crucial feature of success, and the planning of distributive bargaining is implicitly bound up with the calculation of what we call target and resistance points. The points in our bargaining strategy that we are aiming to get to, the maximum possibilities that we think we might be able to achieve in terms of the bargain. That's our target point, and our resistance point is the point beneath which we're not willing to move. So the minimum that we're willing to settle for. So our planning around entering into a distributive bargaining really hinges around our calculation, our identification of these target and resistance points, and we'll think with some degree of detail about how we arrive at those points. And the calculation of those points is implicitly bound up with our sense of utility and our sense of probability of achieving certain outcomes. The final thing that we'll talk about in relation to distributive bargaining are the development of particular bargaining strategies. Now, there's a lot of detail that we could go into in respect of bargaining tactics, and if you want to look at some elements in relation to bargaining tactics, there's a handout on Blackboard that will assist you in this, or indeed you can look in Walton and McKersey and get a lot of detail from the source. But we're going to deal with this at the level of strategy and think about the kind of broad issues that influence how we bargain, and we're going to break this down into basically the choice between hard and soft bargaining strategies and the kinds of things that we can do to influence positive, more favourable outcomes from our point of view from entering into these particular bargaining strategies. So that's distributive bargaining. We'll spend probably the bulk of our time in this podcast dealing with issues of the distributive bargain. The second area of bargaining that we're going to look at today is linked to distributive bargaining. It's very much associated with distributive bargaining, and this is intra-organisational bargaining. Now, what we're concerned with regards to intra-organisational bargaining is not so much the relationship, directly anyway, between ourselves and our opposite numbers, between management and unions, if you like. Intra-organisational bargaining is concerned with internal conflict. In a sense, it's to do with those kind of principal-agent conflicts that we've been talking about throughout these employment relations podcasts from time to time, because the principal-agent relationship is not an easy one. It's not straightforward, and conflicts between the objectives of the bargaining principles and the bargaining agent can very often arise, and particularly within a distributive bargaining context, there can be distinctions between what the negotiator is aiming for, what they're prepared to settle for, and what the principals would really like. So intra-organisational bargaining processes are about how those conflicts play out, and particularly about how we might seek to go about resolving those conflicts. So we'll have a look at how those issues of conflict arise, and we'll also look at a variety of different approaches concerning how we might go about resolving those particular types of conflict. So that's the framework for the podcast as we're going to tackle it today. We're going to start with a bit of a discussion about distributive bargaining in general. And the key issue about distributive bargaining is that it's concerned with the maximisation of shares from limited resources. Now, this is something that we should counterpose to the discussion that we've previously had around integrative bargaining, where the assumption was that we didn't have limited resources, that the resources could grow depending on how innovative or how imaginative we were in terms of solving problems, in finding innovative solutions to the issues that we faced. Now, distributive bargaining has a very different character simply because we are working on a very different basis. We're working from the basis that we have limited resources. If you remember from the integrative bargaining session, we talked about how Walton and McKersey suggested that integrative bargaining was probably not best suited to issues of resolving pay, particularly pay level, was the point that I made in that session. And the reason is that where you have issues of pay level, the resources are limited. That if you take more pay, more resources from the organisation and push them towards pay, then they're not available for other activities, for other stakeholders, for other parties. The resources are limited. And so distributive bargaining is about how the various actors, how the bargaining parties seek to gain the maximum share of those limited resources for their own side, about how they maximise those shares at the expense of others. Now, because of this maximization type of activity, and because the resources are limited, there is an implication in distributive bargaining that conflict will exist, that this is a conflictual type of bargaining situations, that conflict will exist over those bargaining issues. Now, this doesn't mean, and we shouldn't take this to mean, that therefore it's a terrible thing. Yes, there will be conflict to a greater or lesser extent over the outcomes of this particular bargaining activity. Generally, that conflict, though, will be seen to exist within a broader relationship which is seen as beneficial. This is something that is seen as part and parcel of managing the employment relationship. Not a bad thing in itself, not something we should avoid at all costs, but something which is just simply part of the overall package, and that overall package, the broader employment relationship that enables this conflict to exist, is seen as being mutually beneficial. Now, the extent to which the employment relationship remains mutually beneficial is more or less constrained by the boundaries of mutual benefit, the extent to which we're still all getting something out of this employment relationship. Those boundaries represent the extent of the potential bargaining area. That's the scope that we've got to bargain around. Now, we're going to spend a little bit of time at the start of this podcast really trying to examine these issues of boundaries and the extent of potential bargaining that we can play around in, because this is the first step really for a bargainer to understand just what is possible to try and get, what's possible to ask for, what's possible to demand. How far are they likely to be able to push the other side? To what extent can they seek an outcome without damaging the relationship as a whole? So this is what we're engaged in. We're engaged in the division of a fixed sum, but within that fixed sum, the share for each side is variable. So let's examine this a little bit further. So, potential outcomes of a distributive bargain. Firstly, that we end up with the distribution of shares between the parties that will be more or less advantageous for either side. So there's a certain finite amount of resources available in the pot, and as a result of the distributive bargain, as a result of management and union kind of beating each other up for a little bit, one side will walk away with more share of those resources than the other. The outcomes will be more or less advantageous for either side. The other potential outcome of a distributive bargain is that after all of those kind of processes, after each side beating each other up a little bit in the negotiating room, they're still not able to agree on the shares of these resources. And in that kind of situation, we reach a position that's described as the default position. And in the default position, we have one side, or maybe both sides, insisting on outcomes that are actually beyond the fixed amount available. Now, in this situation, the distributive bargain effectively breaks down, leading to both sides sustaining mutual losses. Now, it might be a strike, it might be a situation where labour is withdrawn, which is designed to hurt the organisation, ideally from the union side to hurt the organisation just enough so that they will concede a position and bring them back to the negotiating table, or if it's more serious, to perhaps a permanent breakdown of the relationship, which might lead to the entire workforce being dismissed and replaced by another workforce, or perhaps for the organisation to close down because of the losses that they sustain. So the default position is quite a serious position to get into. Now, in order to avoid the default position, it's very important for a bargainer to understand just how far they can go, what the boundaries, what the limits of the bargain might be. So how do they go about doing that kind of thing? Well, the first thing to understand is that there will be upper and lower limits of bargaining outcomes. So, perhaps we need to spend a little bit of time thinking about how we define and how we identify what those limits might be. Now, we'll think about this from the kind of, I suppose, from the perspective of the employees. So the upper limits of the bargaining outcomes, say the very high level of a pay award being negotiated through a distributive bargain. Now, the upper limit is one beyond which the employer feels that they have to find a new employment relationship, that the labour costs have been pushed so hard, so far, that they can no longer sustain the employment relationship on that basis, and so therefore they look for an entirely new workforce. So there's a fixed top point beyond which the employer is simply not able to go, or not willing to go, and at that point would seek to replace the entire workforce with a new one and build a new employment relationship. The lower limit is kind of the mirror image of that, because if you remember, we're thinking about an employment relationship which is based upon an employment contract, based upon an effort and reward bargain. And so just as the employer may have limits at the top end about the rewards that they're willing to offer, the employee has limits at the bottom end below which they're no longer willing to provide their effort. They're no longer willing to provide their labour. They're not going to work for less than that. So the lower limit is defined by that point beyond which employees will look for a new employer, or perhaps they just look for somebody else to represent them. So we have these fundamental limits to bargaining outcomes, a top limit and a bottom limit. Now, there are also some further discussions that we need to have about the limits to the usefulness of the employment relationship, because of course bargaining needs to remain within the limits of usefulness for the relationship to continue, not just about staying within these kind of fairly broad, fairly extreme upper and lower limits beyond which the employment relationship just breaks down completely. There's a lot of room for manoeuvre within this, which constitutes some of the usefulness of the employment relationship. So when we're understanding bargaining objectives and bargaining behaviour, we need to bring a little bit of sophistication into our reading of what is going on, because either side are not simply seeking to maximise their own position against a single bargaining objective. You can't simply read off the utility of bargaining for either side against a particular type of outcome. And the reason for this is that there are all kinds of internal trade-offs that occur within distributive bargains, because whilst it might be fairly easy and simplistic to say that a union or the employees, or however they're constituted, might seek to maximise their outcomes in relation to a certain thing, for example wages, maximising their wages in isolation may have other less advantageous outcomes in relationship to other types of factors. So maxing out on wages, getting a really good deal on pay at a particular point in time because of a particularly favourable bargaining situation or whatever, that might be great taken in isolation, but taken in the round, there may be serious consequences on, say, employment levels. So just because you manage to negotiate a good level of pay one year, that's great, but it may have kind of disastrous implications in terms of employment levels within the organisation as well. So there are trade-offs that we need to understand, and if we're going to understand the way that bargainers behave, and if we're going to understand the interactions that take place within a distributive bargain, we need to take account of these kinds of trade-offs that occur all of the time. We also need to think about the way in which these trade-offs are not always kind of straightforward. They don't always kind of work in a straightforward or linear kind of way. So upping the ante a little bit on wages doesn't always just mean, well, we'll lose a certain number of jobs, if that's the trade-off that we're talking about. Because as we push the limits of bargaining more and more, and as we say push the levels of wages higher and higher towards the upper limit of bargaining, these trade-offs become more and more extreme and more marked, so that the trade-off between wages and jobs can become very, very extreme the more that the wages issues, for example, might be pushed. And this is the reason that once we get to that upper level, that upper limit of bargaining, we can see that upper limit as representing a very sharp discontinuity. We've kind of been trading off wages against jobs up to that point, but we reach a certain point, and once we breach that point, then all bets are off. Employment falls to zero because we've pushed the firm so far that it fails, or we've pushed the firm so far that it can no longer justify or sustain the employment relationship, and so it's looking for a new workforce. So there are trade-offs and there are delicate balancing acts to be achieved within distributive bargaining situations. This is a real kind of hardball activity, and something that if we get it wrong and we read the situation incorrectly and we push issues too far, too hard, beyond the point at which it can be sustained, it can have very serious consequences. So there are very important responsibilities that rest on a bargainer in these kinds of situations. So let's just try and illustrate some of these issues just by kind of giving some for instances in relation to a particular wage bargain. This is an example which comes straight out of Walton and McKersey. So you can see the examples are in dollars, and the wage levels are actually pretty low, which is a reflection of the age of the text, I suppose. But there's nothing wrong with the example. So here's a wage spectrum, and on that wage spectrum we can indicate where things currently rest. At the present rate that we are negotiating around is at the $2.40 mark. Now, where might we go from there? Where could a bargainer attempt to push that present rate? Where could bargainers on either side seek to move the level of wages to? Now, on the one hand, we can identify maybe if we talk to our workforce, we talk to the people that represent the workforce, the level below which employees would quit. So the lower limit of bargaining we can identify as an absolute limit beyond which we simply cannot afford to go. And we can also identify the point beyond which the company would be forced to move or get rid of the workforce or close down or whatever. We can gather this information. We can take soundings. We can gather informal data. We can do all kinds of things to kind of elicit what the very outer limits of bargaining might be. Now, of course, these represent the ultimate. We can't, as a bargainer, afford to go anywhere near these, really. Because of the risks involved. But there are other limits as well, because if you remember, we're not just dealing with the issues concerning the principals here. We're talking about bargaining agents as well, and they'll have their own internal bargaining limits that they'll have to work within, and which effectively represent the real bargaining limits of the bargaining situation here. So, whilst the employees may have a lower limit down around 220, the union may feel that they can't afford to go below 230, to take a drop of, say, 10 cents in wages on behalf of their members would be a step that may well, they feel, result in the employees looking for an alternative bargaining agent. They'll come out of the union, they look for someone else to represent them. So from the union side, there's a point beyond which they absolutely can't go because of their own particular interests. They lose the right to bargain on behalf of the workforce. On the management side as well, there's a limit that's not the same as the upper limit. And this again is because usually the management who bargain in these situations is not the employer. The manager is acting as the bargaining agent for the employer, and that bargainer will equally have a sense of the absolute limit that they can afford to go before they're replaced by the employer, that they're replaced as bargaining agent, and so they have their own internal limit. So whilst A to B may well represent the ultimate outside limits that bargaining can take place within, C to D is in reality the more effective measure of the boundaries within which the bargain is going to take place, the extent to which bargaining might shift that wage rate here or there in the course of a particular bargaining situation. So it's important for bargainers to take account of those issues, to be aware of where they're able to move the situation, limits to their facility to bargain. So, once we've figured out what the range of settlement points might be, we know that it might be between the upper and lower limits of what the bargaining agents are able to work within. Then we have to start thinking in a little bit more specific sense, a little bit more detail about likely settlement points within that range. And we start by thinking about the relative usefulness, the relative utilities that will apply to each side at each potential settlement point. Now, working out what this likely settlement point might be is quite a complex process, because it reflects a number of things, some of which we may know, some of which we may have some degree of knowledge about, and some of which we're probably guessing a great deal. And so we're having to work on assumptions a lot of the time. We're having to work on possibilities. We're having to work on all kinds of uncertain elements of knowledge. And the better negotiators, better bargainers are able to make these judgments more effectively. Maybe the people who just can keep their ear to the ground much more effectively, who are able to dig out knowledge which improves their reading of the situation, to understand where the other side are likely to be heading, what they're willing to accept, what their real bottom line is going to be. There's a lot of uncertainty around these issues, which adds to the complexity of figuring out a likely settlement point. So we start out trying to think about the subjective utilities of the settlement point. And we say subjective because this is what they mean to different groups. The subjective utility of a particular settlement point from the employee's side will be very different from a subjective utility of a settlement point from the employer's side. And getting a judgment on what these might be can be rather complex and difficult. We also have to think about the probabilities of achieving certain outcomes in any given situation. So we're not just thinking, how much would we like to achieve this, and how much would the other side like us to achieve this, or how hard are they likely to resist it. We also have to think about how likely we are to be able to achieve these outcomes that we might like to a greater or lesser degree. So these two elements, subjective utility and probability, will have a large bearing on where the settlement point of a particular bargain might end up. So we'll think about these issues in a little bit more detail. We start by thinking about utility functions, the extent of usefulness, how much we might want something, starting from the point of view of a union negotiator. And again, these are examples that are taken straight out of Walton and McKersey. And you can see that we've got a graph here with a range of settlement points which reflect that wage spectrum that we looked at a moment ago. And then on the left-hand side, we've identified a kind of scale of utility running from 0 to 7, indicating just how useful various settlement points might be. And so we make a judgment. How much do we want settlement points at different levels? How will settlement at various points alter our perception of the usefulness of them? And so we might draw ourselves a little graph like this to illustrate how useful these settlement points might be. And we can identify the starting point being $2.40, which is the current rate of pay. And so in most wage negotiations, we know that our members, from a union point of view, members will be looking for some increase to offset the cost of living or to indicate progress in some way or another. So a settlement at exactly the level that we're currently on would represent a utility of 0. That provides us with no usefulness, something that we wouldn't seek to avoid, that we would seek to avoid by and large. There are many more favourable outcomes than that. And so we can see the graph arcing upwards in utility as we increase the amounts of pay that we're able to achieve within the negotiation. Now there is an interesting question here, which is why the utility curve here is a curve. Why is it a curve and not a straight line? Why does the utility not just increase in a regular amount for each increase in wages that have been achieved? And we can actually see when we get up to the higher levels of settlement, past $2.60, we actually see that there's a slight decrease in utility between $2.60 and $2.65. Why might that be? Why might the rate of increase in utility start to level off around $2.50? Why does it become a much more shallow increase? And the answer to this, well, partly it might be about those issues of trade-offs that we talked about at the start. The union negotiator might be fearing that they're pushing the wages issue too hard, that might result in job losses in order to balance out the labour costs within the organisation. But equally, it might reflect the fact that unions tend to negotiate across a range of different industries and organisations at the same time, and that striking too high a bargain in one particular situation may leave them vulnerable to increasing the expectations of union members in other organisations and make their job that much more difficult for them. It may be that they have an easy bargain in this situation, which they're not able to replicate somewhere else, and they may be kind of setting themselves a very high target to achieve as the news of a favourable settlement goes around the grapevine of union members across organisations. So we need to take a realistic view about utility at various different levels. And we can see similar issues occurring if we think about the issue of utility from the point of view of the company negotiator as well. We have a situation here where we might expect utility to increase the further that the company negotiator can keep down the wage levels. Now, we see that actually the maximum utility is indeed to keep the wage rate at its current rate, to make no change to labour costs in this particular situation. Of course, this is just an example. But we might think, well, why is more utility not provided by pushing the wage level down even further, if they can get away with it? If the bargaining situation is favourable for the employer, why not push the wage level down? Why is that not more useful than keeping it at its present rate? Well, it may be that the company feels that by doing that they may lose some good people. That people, it's not getting to the point where the employees en masse up sticks and go and look for a different job, but they may start to increase their attrition rate. They may start to see people drifting away around the edges. They may find it more difficult to attract employees from the labour market because their wage levels are no longer attractive enough. It may be they have a problem with motivation if they push wages down that far. It may be, a whole variety of different reasons. But again, we need to be sensitive and contextualize to make sure that we understand what's happening to utility issues in a particular situation. We can't just apply something across the board. We have to think about what the impact of settlement points might be in a given context. And we can see in this case that the rate of utility decline decreases quite sharply as the company negotiator moves closer and closer to that upper limit of $2.60 that we saw earlier, representing the point where the company negotiator will be sacked. And so we need to take account of these situations and take a realistic view about utility. Now, we've been talking about usefulness, about how useful a particular settlement point might be, excuse me, for a particular party. But there are also disutilities that might occur within a distributive bargain as well. Because if the bargainers are not able to agree, if there's a failure to agree, then it doesn't just leave everything the same. Generally, the bargainers don't just go back and say situation as before, status quo, everything remains unchanged, because usually there are consequences for a failure to agree. And often where there are failure to agree may result in a labour dispute. It may result in a work to rule. It may result in a strike, resulting in lost production, lost markets for the employer, and lost wages for employees. Now, these strike costs are very important to take account of, because the strike costs don't always fall on both parties to the same extent. And the greater that one side or the other is able to skew the costs of a strike towards the other side, or equally to protect themselves from the costs of a strike, then the greater power that side will have within the negotiation. And so the calculation of the relative impact of strike costs from each side will have a big impact on how they perceive what the range of possible settlements might be, as well as the actual settlement point at the end. So, how do we start to make sense of these kinds of issues? We might have an idea about what we want. We might have an idea about how much the other side may resist our objectives as well. But we kind of need to put together this picture. We need to put together all of these elements in order to make a judgment about what the range of likely settlement points might be, what our ideal settlement point would be, where we need to start to resist, and where we will not go beyond as a bargainer. This is a fundamental calculation to allow us to plan for a distributive bargain. We're not going into the situation with a clear plan of where we are trying to get to and where we will not absolutely not go to. Then we're kind of finished before we even begin. So we need to make sense of utilities, and we also need to make sense of what we expect in terms of the utilities that we might achieve. So we've got a bit of a calculation to engage in. Let's just give you a kind of taste of how this might work out. So there are two things that we need to combine. We need to understand utility, as we've been talking about, and we need to understand likelihood, probability, or how likely we are to achieve that thing that we would want. So we call this a subjectively expected utility, and we calculate this by, first of all, thinking about a settlement point utility, how useful it is to us, and we multiply that by the probability of its acceptance by the other side. So how much do we want this thing? How likely are we to get it? But there is another side to this equation as well, because sometimes in order to get the thing that we want, we may have to incur costs. We may have to incur disutilities. We may have strike costs associated with failure to agree. And so we need to think about what those strike costs are going to be. How much cost are we going to have to bear? How much are they going to have to bear? And what's the probability of having to incur those costs in order to get what we want? So you can see along the bottom, this little calculation has been building itself up. Probability by utility plus strike cost times the probability of having to incur them. And that is how we get our subjective expected utility score. Now that's fairly complicated and it sounds a little bit abstract. So let's just give you a for instance. Let's give you an example of how this might work out in practice. So before we get to those examples, we'll have a think about probability, because we haven't talked about that yet. And probabilities are, again, a difficult thing to get a hold of. How do we know how likely it is that we're going to get what it is that we want? And the answer is that we do what we've been doing up till now to a certain extent. We estimate it. And we estimate it based on the idea that the probability of success for a particular issue will relate to how much it provides disutility for the other side. So the less the other side wants something that we're after, the less chance we're going to get it, the more they're going to resist it. So probability, has a very strong relationship to utility. We have to be aware, not just of how much we want something ourselves, but how much the other side might want something, or more particularly, how little the other side will want something, because the less they like it, the more they're going to resist, the more difficult it's going to be for us to get what we want, and the less probability we have for success. Probability is also related to potential strike costs. Like I said a moment ago, if one side or the other is able to skew the strike costs towards the other side, then that increases that particular side's chance of success. So, for example, if a union is able to build up a substantial strike fund in advance of a dispute, it collects a levy of funds from its members prior to a negotiation, so that it's in a position to protect the earnings of its members if a strike happened to occur, then the chances are that the costs of the strike is going to fall more heavily on the management than it is on the union, because the union is able to keep its members in income They're not going to have problems paying their bills. They're not going to face problems with the strike disintegrating because people are going back to work because they feel desperate and they're challenged financially, all those kind of things. So a strong strike fund increases the strength of the union. It skews the strike cost towards management. Conversely, if the union has no strike fund or management is able to build up stocks of its products in advance, then in the result of a strike, it can just start using its backed up products. It can supply its customers with its products that it's been building up for a substantial period of time. It's not suffering during the strike, but the members of the union are, because they're not earning anything. In that case, the strike costs are skewed towards the union, and therefore the probability of achieving the outcome of the union is that much less. Now, assuming that we've got those utility calculations and we've got the probability calculations, we can then start to calculate the subjective expected utility scores for various settlement points. So we can plan, we can think, well, okay, if we were able to settle at this rate, okay, how much utility does that have for us? What's the probability of achieving it? How likely is it that we're going to have a strike to get this? What's the cost of the strike to us? And we can do that for each one of our settlement points. Now, this provides us with something very valuable. It provides us with a sense of what our optimum settlement point might be. If we were going in blindfold into the process beforehand, not knowing exactly how it's going to pan out, but we would be able to say that's the figure that we should attempt to settle for, because it provides a good balance of utility. It may not be the best outcome for us in terms of utility, but it provides the best balance between utility and cost. We're going to get the best outcome with the lowest cost balance. We also indicate what potential high and low points there might be for our settlement range. What's the highest we can reasonably aim for and get the best outcome from a utility point of view, which maybe it's got a higher probability of costs attached to it, but it may be worth it if we're able to pull it off. And what are the low points? Where can we absolutely not afford to drop beneath? Now, these represent the target and resistance points for our bargaining activity, and so they're very useful values to know. And the benefit of calculating subjective expected utilities like this is that they're not based on kind of sucking your finger and holding it in the air and see which way the wind blows. They're based on hard data, but a kind of structured approach to estimating and calculating what the range of settlement points might be. So this is how it might work out in an example. So we have a range of different levels of increase, ranging from 0 up to 15. And so we start to think about the utility of those particular increases. And we've already indicated an increase of 0 provides us with a utility of 0, whilst an increase of 15 provides us with a very high utility of 6. We then have to think about how likely it is that we're going to get it, the probability. And in this case, 1 represents certainty. We're certainly able to sustain our current level of pay, but we probably think that an increase of 15, which has the highest utility for us, is actually impossible. So this estimation of utility and probability provides us with the first part of our equation. We do the calculation, we multiply one by the other, and we can see that at either end of the spectrum, an increase of 0 and an increase of 15 actually provides us with a net outcome at this point of 0, either because it provides 0 utility or 0 probability. The other settlement points in between vary to a certain extent. At this point, an increase of 7.5 looks like the best combination of utility and probability. So this is kind of the lead runner going into the next phase of our calculations. So the next thing that we have to consider is the issue of strike costs and the probability of incurring the strike costs. So strike costs represent a negative number because they're a cost, and we've just put a kind of a random number of -2. It might be more, it might be less, depending on how severe we want to calculate the costs of the strike. We also have to think about how likely it is that we're going to have to incur those costs, how likely it is that we're going to have to incur a strike in order to get what we want. And of course this might work for either the union or the management. Now, from this perspective, we do the calculation. We look at the chances of incurring the costs multiplied by the costs themselves. And again, the probabilities work the same way. So the probability of having to incur a strike cost to get an increase of 0 is, of course, 0. Whereas in order to get an increase of 15, and it's absolutely certain from our perspective that a strike would have to be incurred. So we do that part of the calculation. We multiply the costs of the strike, multiplied by the chance of incurring those costs, and we get a figure indicated there. And then, in order to get our SEU, we add the figure from total 1 with the figure from total 2. And this provides us with our overall subjective expected utility. Now, we can see from this that our SEU for a 0 increase is 0, but equally that our SEU from a 15 increase is -2. So this is really a no-go area certainly from a union negotiator point of view. Let's have a look at that other figure, 7.5, which was leading the race as the kind of prime candidate for where we should be targeting our settlement point at the end of the first bit of that calculation. We can actually see that because we've calculated that it's kind of 50-50 chance of having to incur a strike in order to get that particular settlement, that's kind of knocked down the usefulness, the overall utility, the overall subjective expected utility of a 7.5 increase as a target for what we're after. It's no longer the front runner. The front runner, the one that we're going to plan for, is an increase of 5, because that provides the highest SEU. The SEU is 1.2, and so we can identify that as our optimum target, the best balance between how much we want something, how likely it is we're going to get it, the costs associated with getting it, and the chance of incurring those costs. Once we take all of those factors into account, that looks like the best bet. But there are also 2 other figures that are very important to understand here, and those are the figures that are either side of the optimum figure in this particular case. And the reason why these 2 are important is because if we look beyond those points, so we look at the SEU scores beyond those points, we see a very sharp dropping away. So at the top end, best that we might be like to get is that 7.5 figure again. Still got a positive SEU of 0.75. It's not as good as the optimum target, but it is actually a better outcome from the point of view of, say, union members in respect of this. If we can get it, we have more chance of incurring costs and those kinds of issues. But on the ground terms, union members would probably appreciate this more because it's a better pay rise. If we look at the next settlement point up, at the increase of 10, we can see that the SEU has dropped away very sharply from 0.75 to minus 0.6, a very sharp drop off in SEU. At the lower end, the last positive settlement point in terms of SEU is an increase of 2.5, which has an SEU of 0.7. Now again, beyond that, quite a sharp drop away to 0 from 0.7. Now we can identify these as significant boundaries to the various settlement points and the SEU scores of the settlement points. And so they indicate to us something significant. They indicate the top range that we can reasonably aim for, and they represent the bottom range that we might be prepared to accept. And so as bargainers, these are absolutely vital pieces of information in order to plan our particular bargaining strategies. So, armed with these kinds of ideas, this helps us to go towards the bargaining situation with not necessarily confidence, but with some idea of what it is that we're aiming towards. Now, of course, the settlement range that we might have come up with, our target and resistance points and everything in between, isn't the only thing that's on the table. Our opposite number also has presumably done their calculations and come up with a settlement range, the things that they are aiming for. Now, in terms of the bargaining range, of course, the range itself will be described by the intersection between the respective settlement ranges. That's the extent to which there is scope for a positive settlement. Now, if all of our information is accurate and we've done the calculation correctly, and we know what the appropriate range is going to be, then all that's left for the negotiator to do is to go in and bargain hard and grab as much of the bargaining range for your side to get the most benefit out of the bargain that you possibly can. Now, in practice, of course, our estimates are more or less inaccurate because they're based on guesses and estimates and, I heard a rumour and all of this kind of thing. Now, that means that the intersection between the range that we've calculated for ourselves and what we might expect our partners to have calculated is probably going to be a little bit smaller. And so that provides a smaller settlement range that we can move within between our target range and between the various resistance points. It's potential that there might even be a negative settlement range where no agreement at all is possible. Now, just to illustrate what this looks like, we'll just kind of sketch out in abstract how these ranges might be described. So we've got on the union side their target point up there and their resistance point back there. Management decided their resistance is going to be a little bit less than the union's target, and their target is going to be a bit less than the union's resistance, and the intersection is there between the two resistance points. That represents the actual scope for the deal. Now, obviously, if your target was the other side's resistance and vice versa, then the scope for the deal would be the full range. As it is, it's a bit less. Sometimes we can get it completely out of skew, so that the target point and the resistance point on both sides just don't match up at all. The resistance points are kind of in negative equity and there is no scope for a deal. And in that situation, you're either heading for conflict or you're heading back to the drawing board to recalculate what is reasonable, what is possible in these kinds of situations. So once we've done our planning, once we've planned our settlement range, once we know what our target and resistance points are, we need to think how we're actually going to bargain. And this involves choices about hard or soft bargaining strategies. Now, as mentioned before, there are lots of bargaining tactics and there's handouts that is available on that, and lots of literature available to help you to engage effectively in bargaining tactics. But strategic choices are important, and that's what we're going to talk about here. Now, bargaining strategy is about thinking what you're going to do in relation to your opponent. So we know that an opponent has two choices, effectively. The opponent can choose to bargain soft, to give way, to be amenable to change, to accept your arguments and so on, or they can bargain hard. They can be looking to achieve their own objectives, to really screw you over. And your choice is how to respond to the opponent. And so for yourself, term party, using Walter McKersey's terms again here, you have a dilemma. And the negotiator's dilemma is represented by a choice of a soft bargaining strategy, which coupled with the opponent's choices of bargaining strategy gives you some chance of some kind of payoff. If you bargain soft and your opponent happens to bargain soft as well, then you're going to just split the spoils, aren't you? You're simply going to bargain and divvy things up between you. But if you bargain soft whilst your opponent is bargaining hard, then they're going to take most of what's available. You're going to come away with very little and they're going to walk away with most of it. And so you think, well, maybe what I should do is be bargaining hard. If you bargain hard, then you have got a chance of coming away with most of the spoils if your opponent happens to bargain soft. The real risk of this bold strategy is that it comes with the chance of incurring very high costs, because if you're both bargaining hard, then the chances are that you're going to reach the default position. There's going to be some kind of a breakdown in the process, and you're both going to incur costs of some extent. And then the question is simply one of how well you've prepared for the dispute and how much of the costs you've managed to be able to kind of skew towards the other side. So that's the basic choice of strategy, hard or soft strategy. Clearly most of the games are around a hard strategy, but only if you can get your opponent to soften their position. So in terms of strategy, the key issue is about how to get your opponent to bargain soft. Because if you can get your opponent to change to a soft bargaining strategy, then that increases the chances of you walking away with most of the spoils. So if you can somehow or other increase the probability of a soft strategy from your opponent, decrease the chance of a hard strategy from your opponent, then the impact is that it reduces the subjective value of a soft strategy for yourself. It increases the value of a hard strategy. There's much more usefulness for you going in hard if you're pretty certain that the other guy is going in soft. You know that you've got a good chance of walking away with most of what's there. The problem is that altering your opponent's perceptions is not so easy. It's a very difficult thing to change the way that people think. So generally what we see negotiators doing is not trying to directly alter the attitudes of their opponent, but rather to convince the opponent that you are going to do something in particular. And that something in particular is that you are going to be committed to a hard strategy. So if you can convince your opponent that you're committed to a hard bargaining strategy, they know that you are kind of pretty much committed to going hard regardless, then they're faced with a choice. They're faced with going in soft and coming out with a little bit of something. They'll come away with something, not nothing, not much, or they can match it with a hard strategy and face kind of big costs. So these commitment tactics, the idea of convincing your opponent you're committed to a hard strategy, is a big part of the lead up to these kinds of negotiations. And so we'll see a lot of big talk usually in the lead up to an employment relations bargain of this type. We see people talking up their desperation for a big settlement. They might make statements in front of their bargaining principles so that they are kind of bound by what they're saying. It's not just stuff that they're saying in the negotiating chamber, they're saying it to the people that they represent, so it's harder for them to kind of backtrack. These commitment strategies are not aimed at the principles themselves, they're actually aimed at their opponent, because like I say, if they can convince their opponent that they're committed to a hard strategy, then the opponent has a very difficult choice ahead of them. Perhaps the most favourable one is to go fast, to go soft rather. Now, whilst you may intend to do this, there's equally nothing to stop your opponent from doing something similar to try and get their hard strategy in first. And so we see a lot of brinkmanship leading into negotiations with both sides talking up the absolute nature of their bargaining position. And then once the negotiations are engaged, we see little bits of reorientation of the negotiators with relation to each other as they attempt to negotiate their way towards a settlement point. And where that settlement point happens to be depends upon the quality of the tactics that are employed, the negotiating skill, plus the objective strength of the bargainer, the extent to which they're able to offset the strike costs and all of those other kinds of factors. So that's distributive bargaining. The second thing that we're going to talk about today is intra-organisational bargaining. Now, as I mentioned at the start, intra-organisational bargaining is largely concerned with these agency issues that we've discussed before now. And the agency issues are important because where there is a separation between bargainers and principals, then these conflicting interests between them may develop. And so they need to be resolved in one way or another. And intra-organisational bargaining provides bargainers with some tools, some techniques, some strategies that they can use to manage those conflicts. Now, just to understand where these conflicts come from in the first place, there are a couple of different sources. The first source of conflict is something that we call boundary conflicts. And boundary conflicts are to do with the fact that as a bargainer, you're in a very unusual position. You are in a bargaining environment in order to represent your principles. So you have that relationship with your principles. But within the bargaining situation, you also have a relationship with your opposite number, with your bargaining partner. You develop ways of working with each other. You develop a relationship. You develop a degree of trust. You have certain expectations of each other. And so your role as representative and your role as bargaining partner can sometimes become conflicted. And where the boundary lies and where you exist in relation to the boundary can be a difficult issue to resolve. And so boundary conflict is a large source of these intra-organisational conflicts that we see exist and a large part of these agency issues. The second source of conflict is something that we call factional conflict. And factional conflict is about disagreements on your own side, that there may be conflict around what it is that you should be bargaining for, the kind of substantive objectives that you might be seeking to achieve. And it might also be about how you should best go about achieving those objectives. So there may be parts of your own organisation, your own group, who are particularly militant or hard-headed or not willing to compromise or whatever, whereas others are maybe much more cooperative or more willing to compromise. And so these different factions create difficulties that the bargainer has to deal with in terms of the resolution of these particular types of issues. So we see these conflicts occurring to a greater or lesser extent, partly because of the forces that affect the goals that people are motivated to try and achieve, and that might be because maybe there's a very large distinction, large gap between the institution and its members, and this particularly affects the union side. So the more that the union kind of sees itself as representing the members rather than being part of the membership, the greater those distinctions, greater those kind of differences in goal motivational forces might seem to be occur. And equally, the more heterogeneous the member groups might be, then the more likely these conflicts are likely to arise. If you've got a very if you've got a large amount of commonality between the people that are represented in a group, the more likely that they are to see the issue in a particular way. The more differences, and the more different interpretations are likely to exist. We also see the importance of various emotional forces, that people feel various things about bargaining objectives, and that might be based upon the fact that things have always developed in a certain way, or because people are reflecting on things that have happened to them, and that might affect the kind of emotional judgments that they're making about what should be achieved in a particular bargaining outcome. And then there are all kinds of perceptual factors that occur. Perceptions about what might be achieved in a particular bargaining outcome, and that might be because of the amount of information that's available to individuals. Some people might be better informed than others, and so are able to make a different judgment about what reasonable outcomes there may be. Sometimes it might be that the complexity of the decisions that have to be made in the bargain affect the way in which perceive likely outcomes, and also the novelty of the decisions that have to be made. If this is an entirely new situation, then it's very difficult to predict, or the kinds of predictions that people make about what should be coming out of the bargaining situation might be very varied because nobody's been in this situation before. So there are all kinds of sources of different preferences that people might have for coming out of the bargaining situation, and also how feasible people might feel about how likely different preferences might be. So all kinds of conflicting expectations that a bargainer may have to deal with for these variety of different reasons. So how is internal conflict like this to be resolved? Well, the key issue is that a bargainer, in order to resolve the conflict, has to close the gap between what principals want from them and what they're able to achieve. So if principals are expecting something right up at one end of the spectrum, and the bargainer is only able to achieve something much more modest, then the role of the bargainer is to close the gap, to reduce that distinction between expectations and achievement. Now, the other thing that we need to think about is, what do we mean by expectations? Because there are two different types of expectations that principals might have of a bargainer. On the one hand, bargaining expectations or principals' expectations might be concerned with the substantive outcomes of the bargain, the level of pay, the amount of holidays that are achieved, what is actually achieved by the bargain. The second type of expectations that people might have might be more behavioural, that a bargainer is seen to behave in a way which is consistent with the expectations of bargaining principles. Now, each of these have their own particular importance, as we see in the kind of strategies that we see bargainers try and sustain to close this gap. Now, in relation to each one of these sets of expectations, substantive and behavioural, a bargainer has various choices. They can conform to them, conform to substantive behavioural expectations, they can ignore them, or they can challenge them, they can attempt to modify them. Now let's have a look and see how a combination of these various expectations and these various ways that bargainers might deal with them might come together and provide us with a variety of different intra-organisational bargaining strategies. So, bargainer has choices on the one hand about behavioural expectations of their own size, modify, ignore, or conform, as we've seen. And they may have choices about the substantive expectations of their own side, modify, ignore, and conform. Now, some of these really are kind of non-starters in terms of what a bargainer can reasonably do. If a bargainer was thinking about trying to modify the behavioural expectations of their own side, it's really not feasible to do that kind of thing in the short term. When we talked about integrative bargaining, we talked about the way in which it was important to change the expectations of the bargaining principles to engage in a different way of bargaining some time in advance. It's not something you can do just on the spur of the moment. So modifying behavioural expectations just like that is something that a bargainer is not really able to do. The second set of kind of non-starter type activities is for a bargainer to conform with the substantive expectations of their own side. You know, of course, you can solve an intra-organisational conflict by just saying, okay, yeah, we'll get whatever you want us to get. The problem is that by conforming to the substantive expectations on the intra-organisational side, it doesn't resolve the inter-organisational conflict. You can't actually necessarily deliver what you set out to do because your bargaining opponent may not let you. So simply conforming to the substantive expectations of your own side is not going to resolve the problem unless your bargaining opponent just completely rolls over and gives you whatever you want. So that leaves us with three viable options, which we call option 1, option 2, option 3, and we'll go through these in a minute. And a fourth one, which while it's not completely ruled out for the reasons that we talked about these other ones, is not really got anything to recommend it. Ignoring the behavioural expectations of your own side and ignoring the substantive expectations really doesn't get you anywhere, and so is not to be recommended. So let's have a look at these three intra-organisational bargaining strategies one by one. So the first option is to modify your own side's substantive expectations, their aspirations. Now, this involves directly confronting your own side's aspirations, seeking to change them. It's about using arguments about, well, a variety of things, about the utility, the usefulness of the issues that they're seeking to achieve, about the feasibility of achieving them, about the potential strike costs. It's about directly engaging with your own side and attempting to modify the way that they see the substantive expectations that they might place upon you. Now, by doing that, that may put you in a position as the bargainer of having to ignore at least some behavioural expectations. To directly challenge your own side, that may be something that puts you at odds with the expectations of how they think you should behave as their representatives. But if you're going to go about modifying their aspirations directly, then you may have to, in turn, challenge some behavioural expectations. Now, this is a fairly dynamic strategy from a bargainer, and so to do this, you really have to have a sense that you've got a good chance of convincing your principals that they need to change their aspirations in this way. You also have to have a fair degree of confidence that you can get away with this potentially deviant behaviour. So if you feel like you're on dodgy ground at all, if you feel that your position as bargaining agent isn't as strong as it might be, then this might be something to think twice about. You really only should be considering this when you've got some degree of confidence, both of convincing your principals and of getting away with the deviant behaviour. So that's option one. Option two has slightly different characteristics. Now what we're doing here is again attempting to modify the expectations of your own side whilst conforming to their behavioural expectations. Now in this situation you're not directly taking on your principles in the way that you did in the last example. The modification that comes to the substantive expectations of your principles is seen as something that develops naturally from the situation. This is where the importance of those that conformity to the behavioural expectations comes in. You are showing that you're doing everything that you can reasonably be expected to do. You're behaving forcefully in the negotiation. You're taking on your opponent. You're doing everything that you're supposed to do, apparently, whilst allowing the bargain to develop in such a way that when the compromise has to come, when they're not able to achieve their aspirations on the substantive side, well, it's not your fault. You did everything you could reasonably be expected to do. The situation just developed naturally from the situation itself. It's much more of a kind of defensive type of strategy on the part of the bargainer to deal with this intra-organisational conflict. The third and final intra-organisational strategy is I suppose a more risky strategy. In this situation, what you're doing is ignoring your own side's aspirations. Now, say you're ignoring your own side's aspirations. You ignore them in the final analysis. You ignore them at the point of agreement. Up to that point, you appear to be going along with those aspirations. So you're being entirely complicit with their behavioural expectations. You effectively don't do anything about the divergent aspirations. You may feel that the principles are crazy, that what they're aiming for is entirely unrealisable, but you go along with it. And then when it comes to actually making the agreement with your bargaining opponent, you make that agreement based on your own judgment. And at that point, you make that judgment based on the gamble, I suppose, that this is going to be accepted by your principals as a fait accompli. It's done, it's dusted, it's finished, the negotiation is over and there's nothing that we can do about it. And so basically you just ignore whatever they do, whatever they want, comply with them behaviourally, do what it is that they expect you to do, but make a different agreement at the end of the process. Now, of course, there are huge risks that are attached to this. Not necessarily risks about this individual agreement, because once an agreement is made, it's made. But there are certainly huge risks of discontent amongst your bargaining principals after the event with this one, and you may have some problems in reining back the discontent, winning back trust amongst the people that you represent if you engage in this kind of strategy. And this may be a difficult thing for a bargaining agent to do more than once, certainly. So that's intra-organisational bargaining, a complex set of issues which is often connected to the distributive bargaining issues that we dealt with earlier. So we'll leave it there for today and move on to other issues.